coming up on this episode of The Roundtable.
If your full-time students doing 4 courses are not working 36 hours, you're not compliant with what universities have promised the U.S. Department of Education. Now, nowhere is that the case. The average student, 4-year full-time student, works maybe with classes 18 to 20 hours a week right now, which means institutions almost across the board are committing fraud simply to keep their institutions from being legally liable. Legislators ought to hold oversight. They ought to drag deans and provosts and chancellors up in front. They ought to have them explain what do they know about how much work students are doing. They ought to show them the documentation. They ought to show them the reporting on learning. This ought to be a scandal that students are being allowed to slouch through with minimal time and effort while paying full freight tuition and mostly amusing themselves on their phone.
Welcome, everyone, to another special edition of the Claremont Institute's and the American Minds podcast. We're calling the Cincinnatus series, where we are spending the next 5-6 weeks or so going through some policy ideas for state legislators as they try to right the ship while the feds are going at a breakneck speed as well. I'm very happy to be joined by Rick Hess, a senior fellow and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and his colleague Beth Akers, also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, specializing in the economics of education policy, among other things. And then my colleague is joining us again, Scott Yenor, our senior director for state coalitions at our Center for the American Way of Life, and also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and his day job is at Boise State University, so don't hold it against him. We wanted to get into, this is part 2 of a series on education policy and how the states ought to think about it and how state legislators ought to think about it. We talked last week about a bunch of stuff for accreditation, among other things, but Rick, I was wondering, I know you like to think a lot about systems, and so I'm curious if there's anything you would recommend. We can start very general and maybe descend to some specifics about what state legislators should be thinking about incentive-wise or system-wide, especially for higher education and how to reform higher education.
Yeah, it's a great question. It should be an interesting conversation. Look, I think the place to start is to recognize that higher education has an important mission, right? We want higher education to educate Americans to be good citizens, to master important domains of knowledge, to be prepared for the workforce, to uphold kind of the civic health of our communities. It's not doing that. And in fact, it's doing what it is encouraged to do, which is hire people who publish lots of papers that never get read, to collect lots of research dollars out of Washington, and then use the overhead to pay for bureaucrats, and to make sure that kids get a piece of paper at the rate as best they can, whether or not they've learned a darn thing. So how do you start cleaning this up? You start by encouraging institutions of higher education to focus on education, which means you make it clear that faculty should teach, that there's an expectation that they will teach in a way that is meaningful and rigorous, that will be part of their evaluation, that will be part of how they are hired and promoted. You make clear that students are expected to actually do work, that students are expected to demonstrate mastery of important knowledge, that diplomas need to be earned. And you need to make sure that the role of research, especially at non-research institutions, is complementary. That publishing a paper nobody ever reads is swell, but that's actually not what we're hiring faculty for. They're there to teach, they're there to mentor, they're there to shape, and that these responsibilities ought to be sacrosanct rather than peripheral. Right now, that's just not the case, even at publicly supported, publicly funded institutions. And if we start by tackling those incentives, the big stuff, I think a lot of the other stuff, people will have less time for tomfoolery. They'll have less incentive to kind of use colleges as a platform for nonsense if they're actually busy doing the work for which they're hired.
Yeah. How should state legislators think about how active a hand they should take in intervening? I'm thinking you mentioned the importance of teaching, and Scott and I have talked on the last episode, but we wanted to expand it a little bit. This question of general education, and I mean, should state legislators be basically setting the general education curriculum?
Sure,
if they need to. Yeah,
sure. I mean, these are especially at public institutions. Look,
yeah.
as you guys know, and most of the viewers probably know, 75-80% of higher ed in this country is provided by public institutions. Mm-hmm. They are publicly funded. They are publicly supported. The folks who are paying the bills, the representatives of the taxpayers and voters, have every right to be clear about expectations, about what constitutes a meaningful course of study. In fact, I'll go you one better. The idea of faculty governance makes sense when we are talking about input from faculty as far as curricula and pedagogy. I think there's an important role for faculty to play. I don't understand why the folks who happen to work at a given institution should get for carte blanche to decide who their colleagues will be. That's not how any responsible organization works. I think legislators and governors absolutely have a right to create mechanisms where they will have input into who is hired as faculty at public institutions, because these institutions are serving a public mission, and that mission should not be defined by whichever faculty wind up kind of getting tenure there at a given moment, but by the folks who are charged with representing the interests of the taxpayers and voters in that state.
So wresting some control over hiring back from merely the faculty. Has any state done this well?
I don't think, Scott, you might have a better idea than I. I don't really know that anybody's tried this on a meaningful scale, but there's certainly models. If you think about how we do judges, for instance, there are mechanisms to have democratic accountability, but within a framework where there's room for meaningful input from folks who are familiar with the day-to-day work of the field.
Yeah. What about the professional schools? I know Scott's thought a lot about it in the Florida context on the law school side, but I think of medical schools as well. How should state legislators think about those sorts of things? Should they be founding new law schools, making their current ones more prestigious, taking more of an active hand in this sort of thing?
Prestige is a funny word in this context. Don Brewer and his colleagues at Rand did this great study on, prestige creep in higher ed 30 years ago. And they pointed out that, what all of the incentives were not to actually do your job well, but to kind of migrate up to the next level of the Carnegie rankings. And how do you get there? You bring in research funds so that you can scrape overhead, and you publish studies that nobody ever reads. So look, I don't think prestige ought to be the goal, but I think making sure that you've got that you've got trained medical professionals in the state is absolutely a legitimate concern of legislators. What would that entail? Well, let's think about this. I just mentioned changing the incentives for arts and sciences colleges, for instance. Mm-hmm. Right now, when you are hiring, you are trying to hire people with more publications. Why? Because it's more prestigious. And people who can get more grants. Why? Because that gets you more overhead. I think the relationship between that and are they good educators? Or are they good mentors? Are they actually interested in the work of the mind? Is tenuous at best, if not kind of an inverse relationship. So I think that's the right question to ask about medical schools, law schools. State legislators ought to be asking their medical schools to prepare general practitioners. They ought to be asking their medical schools to favor folks who actually want to practice in the state.
Right.
They ought to be seeking ways to make sure that they're delivering medical education in a way that is cost effective, so that you're limiting the amount at which you're weighing down your graduates in terms of debt and loans taken. These are the same questions kind of as you think across the board for professional schools. These are absolutely legitimate concerns for legislators. But rather than asking, how do we get into the top 20, it ought to be, how do we make sure that we're training enough people, we're training more people, we're training people in the skills that our fellow citizens need, and we're doing this in a cost-effective manner.
Yeah, one of the things, Rick, that I really liked that you said earlier was kind of making a distinction between the research purposes of a university and the education purposes of a university. When I was in graduate school, it was all preparation for research and no preparation for teaching. And when a state legislator looks at the university, he's thinking all about the teaching, the educational outcomes, to trying to create scientific literacy and numeracy and appreciation for our civilization and workforce education and professional education. That's what they're thinking about. But the disjunction between the preparation of a PhD and the imagination of what PhDs should be doing is it's very dissonant ultimately. And I have been a faculty member for a long time, and how do I put this? Like a place like Boise State has automatic um, sabbaticals for faculty. I mean, if you apply, you get it, as long as you have filled out all the forms. There's never even just an evaluation of whether your research is worth doing. You just have to be able to assert that it is worth doing. And this is like the standard of excellence. And so thinking about ways whereby to make the education outcomes, if you want to think of it like that, of these institutions paramount in how state legislators evaluate those institutions seems to be the key. And here, accreditation is of no help, because they just say, well, do you make a syllabus? Do you have your learning outcomes on it? Check, check. You're good. Do the students make some money after they leave? Oh, they do. You're good. So, I think we have to go back to one element of the pre-research university, and that is something like an entrance and exit exam approach to actually showing that these institutions add value on the educational goals that we have set up, and or something akin to it. Grades don't do it anymore because of the horrible grade inflation that exists all over the country. So, finding some way of elevating the importance of education and denigrating the importance of research, especially in arts, sciences, humanities, and social sciences, I would even say, is crucial to kind of reforming these universities. And I think that can only be done by explicit actions. Like, you're going to teach a 3-3 load, not a 4-4 load, or not a 2-2 load, excuse me. You're going to be evaluated 70% on education outcomes. We're going to make you give post-tests to your students to see what value you've added in this area. And I think that would be kind of an accountability mechanism that states could begin to embrace.
I'll interject and try to bring it back to economics as
Please,
economist
yeah.
does. But it seems to me that there is this renewed interest in accountability from all different dimensions on higher ed right now, including the state legislative perspective, right? We've got consumers becoming more skeptical of higher ed. We've got, I think, state leadership, in a good way, starting to put their eyes on what's happening. And these things about, the way that faculty work, the incentives for research versus teaching. I mean, anybody who takes a look at this model can see something's broken here, or at least there's some sort of dissonance. But I think what's happened is that higher ed got a pass for a long time. There was this sense that it was untouchable, that there was some sort of magic happening there. And as long as the bottom line still worked for students, I think that pass kept getting given. But I think we're in a place now, whether perception or reality, that for the individual, at least the margins are thin enough now that we're starting to say, what's happening here? Wait a minute. What are the faculty incented to do, and what should they be incented to do? And, where can the state play a role? And, I think it's exciting. I think it's a really exciting time that, higher ed is getting more scrutiny from, every interested party here who has the potential to hold them to some account.
I love that. And just to make kind of Scott's kind of point real concrete, what can legislators do?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for instance, in order to be eligible for federal funding for higher ed, so, the whole mechanism that runs through what they call Title IV of the Higher Ed Act, colleges commit that a course of instruction is 3 hours in class and 6 hours out of class. That means a full-time student. This means if your full-time students doing 4 courses are not working 36 hours, you're not compliant with what universities have promised the U.S. Department of Education. Now, nowhere is that the case. The average student, 4-year full-time student, works maybe with classes 18 to 20 hours a week right now, which means institutions almost across the board are committing fraud simply to keep their institutions from being legally liable. Legislators ought to hold oversight. They ought to drag deans and provosts and chancellors up in front. They ought to have them explain what do they know about how much work students are doing. They ought to show them the documentation. They ought to show them the reporting on learning. This ought to be a scandal that students are being allowed to slouch through with minimal time and effort while paying full freight tuition and mostly amusing themselves on their phones. Second real good example, Scott mentioned the 3-3 piece. Look, most faculty tend to be on 9-month contracts. That means they're contracted for 40 weeks a year. They're paid, they're functionally paid for their summer, right? Median associate salary is $95,000, which is a pretty decent year's pay, even though you're technically not working for those 3 months. For the 40 weeks you're working, it seems to me reasonable that the 26 weeks, at least, of fall and spring semester ought to be primarily devoted to acts of teaching, to instruction, to mentoring, to office hours. Call it 30 to 35 hours a week, not a real heavy work week for somebody who does manual labor. That means a typical faculty member, at least at a non-research institution, ought to be teaching a 4-5, give or take. 4 courses, maybe 5 courses, spring and fall. Let's make sure we're asking chancellors and provosts to come up and talk to us about how many hours of work are faculty actually doing on taxpayer dime? What are they teaching? What courses are they teaching? Why are these important courses? I mean, let's throw a whole lot of sunlight on stuff that has been kind of just left to self-governance, because I think when Americans start to find out how little kids are working, when they find out what faculty are actually doing all day, they'll say, my gosh, we're rewarding insane behavior. And in fact, this isn't about vilifying individual students or faculty. This is about a dysfunctional, broken system of higher education, which rewards all the wrong things. And if we want faculty and students to rise to the challenge, we've got to make sure we start rewarding the right things.
I love what Rick said about shining a light on this, because I think so much of what's happening in higher ed makes no sense to the general public if you were just to show them what's actually happening. And so, of course, the legislators have, this tool of bringing institutional leaders, forward to hearings and saying, what the heck is happening on your campuses? There's another tool, though, that legislators have that's really being underutilized, which is the choice of accreditation for public institutions. So this responsibility of oversight, looking into the campus, seeing who's teaching what, how hard are students working, all of that. I mean, that's a big job. And the mechanism that's in place for that to be done is through the process of accreditation, which is these third parties that look on campuses and say, okay, things look good by whatever standard they're using here. And so they can have access to federal student aid. But accreditors are not all the same. They all represent different sets of values. There are potentially new accreditors in the coming years that will be emphasizing financial returns more than, colleges looking like traditional colleges, which I think is a move in the right direction. And state legislators can say, to their public institutions, hey, look, you need to be shopping around, or you need to go to this particular different accreditor because the values that are embodied by the accreditation process that you're currently using are inconsistent with what we hold as, state leadership. And so I think that's one place that's, something that can happen really quickly and make a pretty big change in terms of affecting the incentives that institutional leaders are facing.
Yeah, Scott, you mentioned last week the possibility of states creating their own accrediting institutions in their own state.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now the question of accreditation is one of these wide open spaces. And the Trump administration is very open to every kind of experimentation, new accreditors, states accrediting their own institutions. This is the time to apply for those things. States suing the Department of Education for sitting on their applications for a long time. I mean, I think all of that stuff is now open. I mean, one of the really weird things about this is that when you look at K through 12 education, states have a lot more freedom than they have in higher ed because of the accreditation process. There are no like outside accreditors overseeing your K through 12 things unless you choose them. And whereas higher ed has these like an oligopoly of accreditors that almost all have very similar standards, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
That's right. That's right.
And so they're a homogenizing effect where states might have distinctive things that they'd like to get done in their law schools or even in their normal universities, state universities. They can't do it because of the accreditation kind of above them that constrains them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other element of that is, of course, the federal money that pours into and sustains the universities. And of course, accreditation and the federal money are related to one another. So I want to just go back to one thing that Rick was talking about, just a couple other ideas on accountability measures. Because I do think that doing a grade inflation study of departments in your state universities would be an awesome way of holding them accountable. It would be something that would be a scandal if it were done. If you broke down by departments and asked what the average grade point average was, you could actually see rigor and lack of rigor right there in your eyes. And it's something that is very easily understood. I mean, it's not critical race theory. It's not ideology like that. It's just that some elements of the university don't have intellectual standards. And so 70%, 80% of students will get A's. And like, well, why don't you challenge them more? Like, what are you doing when you have that? Like that question, like put certain disciplines, I think, on the hot seat. And it would be good to get them on the hot seat. So that's just another, I think, low-hanging fruit thing that state legislators pick.
Education departments were looking at you.
Yeah, and to Scott's point, I mean, they're prone to embarrassing themselves. Mike Podgorski, who you guys probably know, did a study a couple of schools. I think University of Missouri was one of them. Years ago, the average grade in University of Missouri School of Education was a 4.0. And when asked for comment on this, they explained, "Well, we're just really good at teaching."
Everyone's above average, yeah.
That just let when you tell when people see that like the only rationale is like we're just it is a way of stripping past a lot of the nonsense. Look, one thing to keep in mind is how ludicrous some of these conversations are. So when I say faculty ought to be teaching 30, 35 hours a week during their semesters, for instance, people go, well, gosh, that's a lot. When are they going to do their other work? Well, if faculty are on a 9-month contract, they're being paid for 1,500 to 1,600 hours of work. Teaching 30 to 32 hours a week for 26 weeks is maybe half of that. So even under this draconian framework, legislators would be saying to institutions, we'd like our faculty to spend half the time our taxpayers are paying them to work actually doing stuff relating to teaching, our college students. The other half they can spend doing their research, doing publications, sitting on committees. And that's not counting the 12 weeks in the summer, which they're either like technically off the books or working on their own grants.
Yeah, I remember asking Harry Jaffa years and years ago about his first job, which was at Ohio State in the 50s, and he was teaching a 5.5. So, things have, it's, what actually, do you guys know the history of that? I mean, when did we start to see this reversion to a 2.2, especially at the fancy colleges?
Really, Scott, you might have a different take on the history. I think it was really, it was a post kind of late 60s Reformation type thing. In the 70s and 80s, especially when you started to get the professorial hiring bubble.
Right.
You started to compete by, of course, promising which faculty would teach less.
Right.
And so what happened over time is prestigious institutions started to bid it down to 3-2, and then down to 2-2, and then down to a 2-1, and in many cases now a 1-1 in kind of high-profile disciplines. And so then what happened was the second-tier institutions, starting in the 90s and 2000s, in order to be in the game, then started to reduce their teaching loads to suit.
Yeah, I would. I began at Boise State. I had a 4-4 load in 2000, but I could appeal if I did research to get it reduced to a 4-3 load. And then it moved to a 3-3 load a decade later. And 7 years later, so 2017, it became a normal 2-2 load. And it's not 36 hours a week. I like change my classes every term, and pour a lot into the classes.
Well,
We all
unlike
have
my co-panelists, I have never been on a teaching faculty, so it's a bit harder for me to say, well, yes, the faculty should be working much harder, right? They all have a better, leg to stand on that front. But what I will say is, some of the models that I like are actually the ones that let institutions come to that conclusion on their own. I mean, I think it's right. I think what we're saying is right, that state legislators should really be pushing in this direction, right? Making faculty work harder, encouraging students to work more hours, right? But I also like the models that, kind of correct the incentives for the institutions so that they can make these changes on their own, so that, we're not forcing, of course, any sort of inefficiencies. And one place that we have seen that is in the state of Texas. They're the only state that has attached performance-based funding to their institutions. So this is, of course, based on employment outcomes, which may or may not be the priority that you think we should be, focusing on. But when institutions succeed in having good employment outcomes for their students, they get basically more access to state level aid. And so, I'd love to see, and we will see in time, if Texas ends up saying, okay, well, maybe we need to hire faculty with heavier teaching loads, or we need to push people in that direction.
So, I mean, I almost always agree with Beth, but in this case, actually,
feel free to disagree, Rick. That's fine.
Well, first thing, and I try to be real careful to say it's not necessarily about faculty working harder, because I know a lot of faculty who teach like 1-1s, and they always seem frantic when we're emailing back and forth.
Yeah, work differently, right?
I think yes. So I think what they're spending a lot of time on is sitting on diversity committees and hiring committees and chasing grants and doing all these things. So they may feel really busy, but and again, if you're especially at a private Research One institution, as long as we put a big warning sign up, like a cigarette pack, like this is not an institution where anybody should get educated, but as long as they're operating with that assumption, that's not clear to people right now. But as long as that were clear, then that. But when particularly at heavily publicly subsidized institutions which present themselves as interested in teaching and in an educational formation, I think it's a huge problem that they're working on the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then the second thing is actually, I am deathly concerned about thoughtful legislators who'd say, well, we got to defer to the institutions right now, because the problem is, I think the institutions have been captured by the claimants. Part of the problem with being a chancellor, with sitting on these boards, is your information flow mostly comes up from the faculty. And so what happens is they are told how hard it is, how they're going to lose prestigious hire. And so what we really need is cold-blooded, gimlet-eyed independent actors. We're seeing it right now in Washington. State legislators and governors can play this role to come in, reset kind of the norms and rhythms and expectations. And then I would be more comfortable on the other side of this transformation. Here's an example of what I mean. Like when I'll talk to folks who sit on state higher ed boards or who are, on a board of regents, and we're talking about this conversation. And I say, well, how much are your faculty teaching? How much are they publishing? What? And they'll say, I don't know. I'll go like, they've got that. They tell me they don't have that information. I'm like, they're lying to you. I'm like, they collect this for tenure and promotion every year. Every department chair, every dean has all this information. And they'll say, well, I asked, but they told me they can't share it, or it's confidential, or they don't collect it. So part of the reason we need legislators to kind of weigh in is because even like the reform-minded members of boards of trustees are getting pushed around and bullied by their kind of colleagues in the institutions. And we need somebody with enough independent leverage to step up and say, guys, like, we've got to do business differently going forward.
Yeah. Beth, I'm curious, are there any sort of economic incentives that wouldn't normally come to mind for state legislators that they ought to pay more attention to than they are?
Incentives for state legislators?
Or really for their approach to reforming higher education.
I mean, I'm always advocate for generally paying more attention to what's happening to outcomes. And in part, that's because I was never a practitioner teaching on a college campus. So I have a bit more hesitation to prescribe what I think should be happening. And I like the idea of the market testing what it is that's happening on college campuses. And the way that we do that is by looking at the labor market outcomes that students have. I mean, there has been a movement in that direction on federal policy. I think state legislators don't really have as much of a mechanism for oversight of those sorts of outcomes, but they could if they were to intervene, particularly through the accreditation being the first mechanism, and also thinking about directing resources based on those sorts of outcomes. So I think it's better for students, better for taxpayers if we do shine a light on those sorts of outcomes and start designing policy in a way that incents better outcomes. I think we are moving in that direction, it seems like, among public interest and as well as interest among lawmakers. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. What about what sort of effects will the coming enrollment cliff have on a lot of this stuff? I mean, if you take that, and for those that aren't well versed in this, we have this dearth of students coming up here pretty soon, and it will not get any better absent some sort of revolutionary immigration policy or something like that, which I don't see in the offing. So they will, how should state legislators think about that? And if you couple that with, I don't know what its fate in the courts will be, but it seems like the Trump administration wants to cap overhead at 15% for federal grants in higher education. It seems like a lot of these institutions are going to have a real, some difficult meetings coming up talking about the bottom line.
Yeah, and then add to that, we've got legislation coming potentially, or even movement through reconciliation. Hopefully that would put additional penalties, financial penalties on institutions when they don't produce those good outcomes. So I think the business model for these colleges, public and private, is going to be changing pretty radically in the years to come. I think the most likely outcome is that we get a lot of consolidation. We're loath to close colleges. There's a lot of sentimental thinking around whether or not that makes sense. But we've had really an explosion of technology and innovation that makes education available to people in different regions online. And so the idea that we need a robust college in every geographic community that has every single program, I mean, that's just not the model anymore. I think that this could push us towards consolidation, towards the bigger campuses. It'll be a boon for online educators, places like Western Governors University. It's going to be sad when people lose their jobs and communities have to reorganize. It's sad. But I think this is probably going to promote a change that was a little bit overdue. And I think legislators will need to be prepared both to withstand the fiscal challenges that are going to come facing their big institutions that will persist through this structural change, and also be prepared to support communities as they deal with what it means to close these small college campuses.
Yeah, I would double down on that. This stuff is already happening. There's lots of universities that are saying things like, oh, we have a $20 million deficit and we have to do program reviews. I keep a list in a Google file of the ones that have recently done it, including flagships like Penn State and West Virginia and University of Nebraska, University of Minnesota. They've all had to do this recently because the confidence of the public has gone down. The costs have gone up to run the places as inflation has gone up. So, you see these universities having to cut $36 million out of their budget. And that usually means that they have to start getting at some meat. instead of just the skin. And they all kind of approach it with the same econometric attitude, which is that they look at the programs that have fewer students and lots of faculty. They're not economical, so they cut those programs, even if they're really valuable to the mission of schools. So to take one example, the University of West Virginia kept gender studies, but got rid of petroleum engineering. Just go, well, all right. Even though basically the petroleum engineering was written into the mission statement of the university. And so these things are going to be happening. And so I do believe that state legislators can shape these program reviews. And because it's prioritizing which programs belong on your university, you may want to sacrifice some, you may want to keep some low performing so-called departments, even though they are low performing, they are really central to the mission. And you might want to get rid of some higher performing majors or programs because they're not central to the mission.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, you're saving something on the bottom line, and you're shaping the education that people are going to be receiving on the university to line up with the plan that you have for that university. So it makes sense that as the demographic cliff comes, the answer is program review. And it's already happening, but it's happening with deference to the professionals on the campuses without any input from the legislators who are actually responsible for the oversight and mission of the universities. So those are the difficult discussions that are going to happen. And it would be even more difficult if we put alignment with the priorities of the university as a major component of program review.
You know, this program review sort of triggers my mind to think about this notion of trade-offs, which of course economists love to talk about. Jason Furman, Obama administration economist, had a piece recently talking about like the broad scope of politics, democratic politics, particularly during the Biden administration, not the Obama administration. And he talked about this idea of, sort of pretending that trade-offs don't exist or, not recognizing that trade-offs exist. And I think that higher ed has long existed in that space. The economic way of thinking, do we need a Russian literature department on our campus, is to say, what are the benefits that it brings based on the values that our institution, that our funders, possess? And then you weigh it against the things that it costs. That's just not a calculus that has been happening on college campuses, not amongst consumers of college, but that's a different story altogether. And I do think this, era of scarcity that will be reined in by greater accountability for colleges, whether it's coming from federal or, state lawmakers or even from the consumer, I think is going to demand, this recognition of trade-offs that's going to force things like program reviews, which in the end is a good thing for this sector. I mean, this industry has really been so incredibly defiant to innovation. And I think that it at some point will be forced to do it. And of course it will be dollars and cents that make it happen. And I think we're on the precipice of that moment.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that legislators and reformers just need to be prepared for is the Washington Monument strategy here. This was, when Gingrich and Clinton faced off in the 90s, and you had, and they had to figure out how do you run the government. Famously, Clinton told the Park Service, shut down the parks, shut down the Washington Monument. It was a great way of focusing kind of public attention on this in a way that helped Clinton kind of win the narrative war. And one of the things I think colleges have shown themselves prone to do, for instance, in the conversation over the NIH kind of indirect cost cap, is not to say, we started collecting indirect costs at the beginning of the Cold War because the nation was building out a research infrastructure on our campuses, and we needed to build labs and we needed to hire staff. And it's reasonable to think that those costs have come down from these insanely usurious rates over the last 80 years. Instead, they said, oh my God, if we can't collect money to cross-subsidize gender studies and to hire kind of our entire DEI staff on the STEM budget, people will die of cancer tomorrow. And, this is going to be the rhetorical tack. This is going to be kind of how this plays out. And so folks need to be prepared And they need, therefore, to marshal kind of the specifics. And that's why this kind of transparency and oversight can be powerful. Because when they start explaining how every dollar scraped out of their budget is a dollar that means a low-income student won't have access to engineering opportunities, it's real important to take a look at what have they protected, what have they cut.
Yeah, people need to keep an eye out on state legislators included for this newish term, or actually it's cropped back up again. Maybe it's not that new, as the Trump administration tries to reform the bureaucracy of malicious compliance. So keep an eye out for folks who are, taking the letter of the law and using it to do the most political and PR damage to the legislature or to the reformers. So keep an eye out for that. I know Beth has to go in just a few minutes to catch a flight. So I wanted to close on this. Rick, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about school choice while I had you here. Is there a state model that you love above all else? What are states doing well? What are they doing poorly? How can it be improved?
Yeah, I think, look, the best approach to this is to think in terms of educational choice rather than school choice, because the goal here should be to make sure that families can get their kids the education that makes sense. From 1990, from the launch of the Milwaukee voucher program in 1990 to about 2020, you saw really incremental and unimpressive growth in the expansion of choice, partly because it was a very kind of piecemeal solution. It was really Medicaid. It was, if you've got a low-income child trapped in an awful school, we're going to help you maybe get that kid into a less awful school. What we've now seen over the last 5 years is really a revolution in how legislatures are approaching school choice, which is, wait a minute, why are we just doing Medicaid? Why don't we think this is an opportunity to empower all families wherever they live? We all experience kind of schools not being there during the pandemic. If what your child likes is they like their current neighborhood school, but the math program is awful, let's make sure they have resources that can get them a functional math program. If you are looking for world language options and all the school has is horrific kind of long-term substitute teachers, let's help you solve that. If you've got a child with special needs and the school district accommodations are garbage, let's help you find a school that actually can take care of your kids. So what model for me, the model that makes sense is education savings accounts, because they give you that choice of schools, but they also give you a choice of non-school options. I think Arizona is probably furthest down this road, though there's a number of states that you can look at. The folks at EdChoice do terrific work, as well as the American Federation for Children, at kind of breaking this down. But if you're a legislator, you're saying what are the must-haves? The must-haves are try to make this available to all of your families, not just some of your families. Try to make sure that families can use it for a range of options, not just whole school options. Make sure that you're taking fiduciary responsibility seriously. I didn't like unemployment fraud during the pandemic, and I don't like it any better when folks are fraudulently ripping off taxpayers through education savings account programs. And make sure you're having a serious conversation about how do we make sure kids are learning, that we're getting academic mastery. That doesn't necessarily mean dropping state mandates and state tests on non-traditional school options, but it certainly means having a serious, sustained conversation about how are we getting evidence that students who are attending schools with the public's funds are really benefiting from their educational experience.
Yeah, well, very well said. We're going to end a little early today just so Beth can catch your flight, but I did want to tease for everyone. Thanks for joining this special series of the American Mind and the Claremont Institute. This is our second. We've had 2 on education policy. We will take up IVF next week, not controversial at all, with Emma Waters from the Heritage Foundation. Inez Statman will be back from Independent Women's Forum, and Natalie Dodson from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. But in the meantime, just wanted to thank you, Rick and Beth, for joining us, and thank you, Scott. And we will talk to you all next week. As always, if you want to find more about what we do at Claremont, go to claremont.org, dc.claremont.org for our latest out of the Center for American Way of Life, where Scott works. Go check out the Claremont Review books at claremontreviewbooks.com, and of course, americanmind.org as well for our daily digital publication. Thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.